Welcome to the third video we are doing in a series on the history of Orthodox missions in the second millennium. As a significant amount of research, editing, materials, and time go into these videos, your support on Patreon is greatly appreciated and allows us to create more content like this and at more regular intervals. Also, we are dependent upon you, our listeners, to spread the word about our videos, so like, subscribe, and share our videos on social media to spread the word. Make sure to ring the bell for notifications, as YouTube will only notify you about our new content if you ring the bell. In our initial video, we had covered the period from 1054 to 1600, while in our second video, we began narrating the major missions of the Orthodox Church from the year 1601 to 1917. In this video, we will continue on this period, as it was so rich in information that we've had to expand it to 2 videos. In this video, we will cover the following missions: the mission to Japan, the North American mission beyond Alaska, the mission to the Uniates, and the mission to the Old Believers. The mission to Japan. In 1859, the Church of the Resurrection was built at the Russian consulate in Hokkaido in northern Japan. It was the first Orthodox Christian church in the nation, and the first priest was a naval chaplain attached to the consulate. But when a plea for priests went out, a 24-year-old theology student by the name of Ivan Dmitrievich Kasatkin heard the call and volunteered to travel to Japan. He was tonsured and ordained with the name Nicholas in 1860, but on the way to Japan, Father Nicholas was delayed for the entire winter in Nikolaevsk on the Amur River in Russia's far east. It was in Nikolaevsk where he met the great saint and hierarch, St. Innocent Veniaminov of Alaska, and asked the great saint for his advice on missionary work. So impressed was St. Innocent with hieromonk Nicholas that the great saint made Father Nicholas a cassock and presented him with one of his own pectoral crosses. Upon arrival in Japan in 1861, Nicholas immediately faced issues when the consul, a Joseph Goshkovich, was unimpressed because Father Nicholas was not from the social elite. This was important because Goshkovich, who was an accomplished Orientalist fluent in both Chinese and Japanese, had expected the priest would minister mostly to the upper-class Russians resident in Japan and would never interact with the rank-and-file Japanese, as the legal code punished with death both Japanese who converted to Christianity as well as the missionaries. Further, Father Nicholas was intensely lonely and plagued by self-doubts, temptations, and personal struggles with whether or not he was doing what was right, wondering if perhaps his services would be more needed in Russian than elsewhere. But the great saint poured himself into studying the Japanese language and culture, as well as Buddhism and Shintoism for nearly 6 years, until one day he met a samurai and administrator of a prominent Shinto shrine named Takuma Sowabe. Takuma was an acquaintance of the Russian consul Goshkovich and was immediately hostile towards St. Nicholas, whom he considered an enemy of Japanese culture and religion. But when St. Nicholas challenged Sowabe on what he actually knew about Christianity, Sowabe admitted he knew very little, but was willing to learn if only that he might say he hated the foreign religion due to having a full knowledge of it. Father Nicholas met with Sowabe regularly and explained the Bible to him. The encounters were exceptionally hostile, and Sowabe was combative, but after several meetings, he became genuinely curious, and after further study, he requested to be baptized, becoming the first convert to Orthodox Christianity in Japan. Soon, Sowabe, who in baptism was named Paul, brought his 3 friends, and after a lengthy catechesis, they too were baptized in 1868, nearly 7 years after St. Nicholas's arrival in Japan. This is important to remember in our missionary efforts. We first have to understand the culture, the language, and the mentality of the people we are missionizing inside and out, and that takes years of intensive study. Sowabe endured intense trials too. Now a Christian, he resigned his office at the Shinto shrine and therefore lost his income. In reaction to this, his wife had a psychiatric breakdown and burned down their house before Sowabe was imprisoned for his conversion. On top of it, Sowabe's son was taken away from him to be raised Shinto. One piece of good news for Sowabe was that while he was imprisoned, the Japanese legal code was slightly adjusted, and instead of being martyred, he was released. But having no family and no livelihood, he became an itinerant preacher like his namesake, St. Paul, and he traveled around the island of Hokkaido. But the Japanese were hard nuts to crack, with only a few hundred showing even moderate interest. Soon, Sawabe and his friend Sakai went to the main island of Honshu, and due to their labors, small groups of Orthodox Christians began to appear. Father Nicholas, now an archimandrite, established missions in Tokyo, Kyoto, Nagasaki, and throughout Hokkaido. A second priest, Father Anatoly, arrived in 1872, and shortly thereafter, persecution began due to bells ringing all day on Easter. Sawabe and many of the mission's staff were imprisoned, and the authorities demanded they renounce Christ, but they all persistently refused. It was only through his personal connections, both in the Russian consulate and the Japanese elite, that Father Nicholas was able to obtain the release of the imprisoned Christians. The following year, in 1873, Japan allowed freedom of religion, and Father Nicholas transferred to Tokyo, leaving the Hokkaido consulate mission in the care of Father Anatoly. By 1875, a purpose-built Orthodox temple existed in Tokyo, along with schools, a theological institute, a library, an orphanage, employee housing, and an iconography workshop. Translations were done first of the Divine Liturgy, and then the Triodian. After that, the New Testament, and finally, spiritual writings. Of immense importance in these writings was being able to cross-reference these translations with those made into Chinese by the mission in China, as the contemporary Chinese script was largely comprehensible due to educated Japanese and, in some cases, simply had to be polished. Earlier, the issue had been that the communities had only one priest, and that one priest, Father Nicholas, being a foreigner, was only allowed in certain cities, but a Japanese priest could go everywhere, so it was decided to ordain the first convert, Paul Sawabe, but he stalwartly refused until ordered to by St. Nicholas. Sawabe was then ordained to the diaconate, and then the priesthood in 1875, while Sakai, the second convert in Japan, was ordained a deacon. By 1886, there were 6,000 Orthodox Christians in Japan, and so 2 years later, in 1878, 5 Japanese men, including the deacon Sakai, were ordained priests, meaning that there were now 6 priests and 27 catechists. 2 years after this, in 1880, the archimandrite Father Nicholas was consecrated a bishop, and in 1884, the Japanese government allowed complete freedom of religion. Therefore, that same year, the construction of the Cathedral of the Resurrection in Tokyo began, only to be completed 7 years later in 1891. During the cathedral's construction, the number of Orthodox Christians in Japan reached 12,000, and in 1882, the All-Japan Council of the Orthodox Church was convened. In the first row, seated on chairs, one can see St. Nicholas of Japan as the 8th from the left. The head of the Chinese mission, Father Flavian Gorodetsky, who later went on to be the Metropolitan of Kiev and lead missionary work amongst the Uniates in Poland and Ukraine, is 7th from the left. We will discuss him later in this episode. In Volume 2 of this series, we discussed the mission to China, and those who have watched it will recall the Chinese priest and martyr of the Boxer Rebellion, St. Mitrofan Yang, who here is seated 6th from the left. In the same row is Father Anatoly Sakai, seated 7th from the right, and next to him, 6th from the right, is Father Paul Sawabe. In the second row, standing 1st from the left, and wearing a white shirt, we see the martyr St. Peter Li Yonggan, who, with his wife and children, were killed by the Boxers. In the third row, 2nd from the right, standing and wearing a white shirt, is another martyr of the Boxer Rebellion, St. Paul Wang Wenheng. By 1896, St. Nicholas wrote to the Russian Synod that in the 40 years since Japan opened itself to missionaries, the Catholic Church had 4 bishops and 92 missionaries with 52,000 believers, while the Protestants had 680 missionaries and 38,000 believers. The Orthodox, though, had only 1 bishop and yet had 23,000 believers. Interestingly enough, Archimandrite Sergius Strogorodski assisted St. Nicholas from 1897 to 1899. Sergius would later become a Patriarch of Moscow and was notorious for his outward cooperation with the Soviet regime in an attempt to soften the persecution, thereby being the name behind the term Sergianism. Even during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, St. Nicholas was able to stay in Japan despite the order that all foreigners were required to leave. In fact, during the war, the Japanese Orthodox Church organized a benevolent society to care for Russian prisoners of war kept in Japan. By 1906, St. Nicholas was made the Archbishop of Japan, and in 1908, due to St. Nicholas's declining health, he was joined by Bishop Sergei Tikhomarov, who had been the principal of the St. Petersburg Theological School. Bishop Sergei would assist and later succeed St. Nicholas as the head of the church in Japan. On February 3, 1912, after nearly 50 years of missionary work in Japan, St. Nicholas entered into eternal rest and was buried in Tokyo. As the news spread of his death, the Emperor of Japan publicly expressed his condolences by sending a gigantic wreath inscribed with the Japanese symbol onshi, meaning the highest gift, along with flowers, to St. Nicholas's grave. The newspapers announced the news, and floods of people, Japanese and foreigners, from government dignitaries and social elite to the peasantry, flocked to his coffin to offer their condolences. Despite the fact it took 7 years to make the first convert, by the time of St. Nicholas's death, there were 266 parishes and missions, more than 33,000 Orthodox Christians, 2 bishops, 35 priests, 6 deacons, and 94 seminarians. All of the clergy were Japanese except for the 2 bishops and 1 of the deacons. St. Nicholas's feast day is celebrated on February 3rd. The Mission to America. After the sale of Alaska to the United States in 1867, the money from the Russian government largely dried up, forcing the mission to become self-sufficient. So in 1874, Bishop John moved the headquarters of the Diocese of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska south to San Francisco. He knew that the survival of the diocese depended entirely upon reaching those in the larger cities and securing funds there, as there was simply not enough wealth in the remote outposts of Alaska to sustain a diocese. Bishop John's successor, Bishop Nestor, was in the process of translating the New Testament into Eskimo when he was killed in a shipwreck while visiting Alaska. His successor, Bishop Vladimir, had been the rector at the Orthodox Seminary in Kelm, in what is now eastern Poland, and he brought more than 20 teachers and students from that seminary in order to aid in missionary work in North America, while simultaneously overseeing the construction of St. Nicholas Cathedral in 1888. During this time, in December of 1898, Bishop Tikhon Belavin became the bishop of the Diocese of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. Prior to this, he had been the bishop of Warsaw, Poland, and later Kelm, Poland. In both positions, he had seen the conversion of a substantial number of Uniates back to the Orthodox Church. Upon taking up his post in 1898, the North American diocese possessed just under 30,000 registered members, more than 40 priests, and almost 30 parishes with 55 schools. Most of the Russians had left Alaska, and the flock was largely indigenous peoples and their descendants, followed by a significant number of Arabs from what was commonly known as Greater Syria, which consisted of what is now Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan, with some border regions of Turkey. Due to this, the Archimandrite Raphael Hawawini was consecrated a bishop in 1904 and assigned to care for the Arabic-speaking parishes, which now formed a vicariate within the diocese. By 1907, there were around 20,000 of these Arab immigrants, and their descendants, within the new vicariate, spread across the east coast and Midwest of America and Canada. Assisting St. Raphael was a certain saint priest named Father Nicola Yanni. Ordained by St. Raphael, Father Yanni was a Lebanese widower who ministered to a territory that stretched from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, and he is referred to as the Apostle to the Great Plains. Additionally, Serbs made up a significant majority of the diocese members, such to the point that there were plans to create another vicariate for the Serbs headed by the Archimandrite Sebastian Dabovic, but the Serbs opted instead to have their own Serbian hierarchy. Likewise, about unknown numbers of Greeks were present, and despite receiving their priests from Greece, they received their antimensia from St. Tikhon, who assigned Bishop St. Raphael Hawawini to care for them. The largest group, though, very quickly became Slavs, known as Ruthenians or Carpatho-Rusins, oftentimes referred to with the slur Hunkies. They came from what is now Slovakia, Hungary, Ukraine, Serbia, and Poland. They were ruled by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire prior to World War I, and they were, almost to a person, Byzantine Catholics. But upon immigrating to North America, they began to realize their true status within the Catholic Church was that of nothing more than third-class citizens. And this is where the great missionary figure, St. Alexis Toth, is worth discussing. Alexis Grigorievich Toth was born in 1853 in what is now Slovakia, but at the time was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Several years after being ordained, both his wife and only child died, and Father Alexis became a professor of both church history and canon law at the local Uniates Seminary in Psarev. In 1889, he was sent to the United States to care for Ruthenian Uniates and was installed in a decrepit church in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in November of that year. A month later, he presented himself to the ordinary bishop of Minneapolis, Bishop John Ireland. It should be noted that due to their relatively high birth rate, as well as the practice of donating a child to the church, the Irish were in near total control of the Catholic episcopacy in the United States and dominated the United States priesthood. With this level of domination and control, they showed little to no tolerance for anyone or anything outside of the Latin Rite, and one of those hang-ups, perhaps out of jealousy, was married priests. When Bishop Ireland met Father Toth, the exchange, as recorded by St. Alexis, revolved around Bishop Ireland outright refusing Father Alexis to serve due to the fact he had once had a wife, even though now he was a widower. Furthermore, Bishop Ireland denounced the Uniates and their hierarchy as being non-Catholics and ordering the local Catholic clergy to also denounce Father Toth as being non-Catholic to their congregations. Immediately after this encounter with Bishop Ireland, Father Toth wrote to his Uniate bishop in the Old Country describing what had happened and asking for support and advice, but he received no reply. In addition, Father Toth reached out to a variety of Uniate parishes who reported experiencing the same hostility in their encounters with Latin hierarchy. St. Alexis later recounted from his study of history he had, for many years, desired to convert to Orthodoxy like so many Uniates had already done, but he had been hesitant up to this point because, like most Uniates, he had thought it was still possible to be Orthodox within the Catholic Church. But his encounter with Bishop John Ireland was the straw that broke the camel's back. That fateful meeting finally spurred him to contact the Russian diocese in San Francisco, inquiring as to whether both he and his flock might be received into the Orthodox Church. After a series of letters were exchanged and a visit by notables from Father Toth's parish, the Russian Bishop Vladimir came out from San Francisco, California, to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and on March 25, 1891, he received Father Toth and his community of 361 believers into the Orthodox Church. This was the beginning of an influx in North America of Uniates back into the Orthodox Church. By the time of St. Alexis's death in 1909, and due to his personal efforts, 20,000 Uniates, comprising 65 parishes, had returned to the Orthodox Church. Doubtless, the attitudes of the Catholic hierarchy itself contributed massively to the influx of Uniates into the Orthodox Church, as Bishop John Ireland was not the only instigator. Case in points, in 1907, Pope Pius X, in a move that can only be described as colossally clueless, if not blatantly idiotic, published Ea Semper, decreeing, among other things, that all Uniate clergy in the United States must be celibate, thereby violating the terms of union so many of these Uniate groups had been promised upon their entrance into communion with Rome. It was a major slap in the face, and it was a reminder that, like a fox who guards the henhouse, no matter what Rome has promised, Rome is the final arbiter of how to interpret that promise, even to the point of reneging on it, and ultimately that you have absolutely zero recourse to a council. Now, some will accuse the Russian Church of taking advantage of Pan-Slavism, but in 1899, St. Tikhon wrote the Holy Synod stating that though he was pleased with the conversion of so many Uniates, noting the influence it would have on Uniates in Eastern Europe, he did not think they should continue to be brought in en masse any longer, as it would create issues later down the road, and that rather they should simply be received on an individual basis. As these Uniates were formerly known as Greek Catholics, in this case, Greek referring to the Byzantine Rite, the largest group within the Diocese of North America were now former Greek Catholics, and this is why, in 1907, the diocese was renamed the Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church in North America. The mission to the Uniates did not stop there, though, and in the 8 years after the death of St. Alexis, that number had risen to 100,000 former Uniates, consisting of 163 parishes by 1917. In fact, even after the fall of the Tsar, which forced the Church in North America to be completely dependent upon private contributions, the mass migration from Uniates to Orthodox Christianity continued, and that number rose to 200,000 in North America alone. Though St. Alexis died in 1909, even as late as 1937, there were large-scale defections, such as when the Uniate priest, Father Orestes Chornok, with 37 other Uniate parishes, converted to Orthodoxy. He was elected as the first hierarch of the American Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Diocese and named Metropolitan Orestes Chornok of Agatha Nicaea. He served until he fell asleep in the Lord in 1977. The initial parishes in North America were, like their Catholic counterparts, founded and filled with immigrants, but, unlike the Catholic parishes, they were surprisingly not specific to one ethnicity and celebrated services in the vernacular. This is contra to the claims of those who would assert that we create ethnic-specific parishes. Case in point, the roster from the 1895 Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic parish, St. Alexander Nevsky in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is representative. 603 Serbs, 476 Carpatho-Russins, 162 Galicians, 150 Arabs, 118 Russians, 29 Greeks, 4 Poles, 2 Montenegrins, 2 Americans, and 1 Moldavian. St. Tikhon was bishop only for 9 years, but he oversaw the building of St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York in 1902 and Holy Trinity Parish in Chicago, Illinois in 1903. In 1905, St. Tikhon also founded the Monastery of St. Tikhons, named after St. Tikhon of Zdansk, in eastern Pennsylvania, when a farm was purchased and 8 monastics were settled there. The church was bare at first, but due to the existence of the farm, the monastery was able to support itself, furnish its church, and establish an orphanage that cared for 15 orphans. Years later, this monastery also established a seminary that is now one of the major seminaries in the Orthodox Church in North America. Further, due to the rapid growth of the Diocese of the Aleutian Islands in North America was made an archdiocese, with auxiliary bishops such as St. Raphael Hawawini stationed in Brooklyn, New York. And in 1905, St. Tikhon also established a seminary in Minneapolis named St. Platon's that offered a 2-year program. It was later moved to New Jersey in 1912. Another seminary, in Sitka, Alaska, was established in 1906 by Auxiliary Bishop of Alaska Innocent. The goal was to establish vicariates for each ethnic group with an auxiliary bishop from that ethnic group, and to a very real extent, the OCA currently has this. One of the greatest figures of the North American diocese, whom we have continually mentioned throughout this segment, is St. Raphael Hawawini. He was born in Beirut in 1861, tonsured as a monk at the age of 18, and ordained a deacon at the age of 24. He later studied theology at the Halki Seminary, where the Greek Church trained their candidates for the episcopacy, but shortly after graduating, he went to the Theological Academy in Kiev, and was later assigned to an Antiochian representative parish in Moscow. He then became professor of Arabic language at the Kazan Theological Academy, which was famous for the translation work related to missions. There, he eventually met persons who would invite him to America in 1895 at the age of 34, already being fluent in his native Arabic as well as Greek, Russian, French, and soon English. He crisscrossed North America searching out Arab Orthodox Christians and organizing them into communities. Due to his efforts, he was consecrated a bishop in 1904, and until his death in 1915, at the early age of 54, he served the Arab Vicariate, which he had grown to 30 parishes and more than 25,000 members. Despite ministering primarily to Arabs, St. Raphael is important in the story of the North American mission because not only was he the first Orthodox bishop consecrated in North America, but it was the Arab parishes that were later to usher in a disproportionately large number of ethnically American converts starting in the 1990s, using much the same model St. Raphael had used. That is, translation of services into the language or languages understood by the congregation, publications in English, and the push to raise up clergy from among the parishes themselves instead of sending for new clergy from the old country. By 1905, more than 80 schools had been established, with 2,100 students. 6 of those schools had orphanages that cared for and educated 115 orphans. It was under the patronage of St. Tikhon that the service book of the Holy Orthodox Catholic Apostolic Church was created. This was the first official translation of texts into the English language in North America, and it was 10 years in development. All of this occurred in the 9 years St. Tikhon was Bishop of North America before he was sent back to Russia in 1907 to become the Archbishop of Yaroslavl. In 1917, he was elected as the Patriarch of Moscow, and in 1925, after years of imprisonment and harassment by the socialist regime in Russia, he fell asleep in the Lord, and his memory is celebrated on April 7th. By 1917, the Orthodox Christians in America had 350 churches, 3 seminaries, 2 monasteries, and numerous orphanages and schools. Of course, with limited time, we can only briefly cover other notable missionary figures who worked in the North American diocese, such as the hieromartyr St. Anatoly Kamensky of Irkutsk. Arriving in America in 1895, he served in both Alaska and Minnesota, and even headed the missionary school in Minneapolis for several years before being called back to Russia in 1905. He suffered under the socialists and was martyred sometime in the 1920s, and his memory is celebrated on September the 20th. Another figure was Ingram Nathaniel Washington Irvine, more commonly known as Father Nathaniel, who immigrated to the United States in 1865 from Ireland. Father Nathaniel was an outspoken supporter of English use in liturgics and was ordained an Orthodox priest in 1905 by both St. Tikhon and St. Raphael Hawawini. He reposed in 1921. The Jamaican-born Father Raphael Morgan was baptized and ordained in Constantinople and attached to the Greek parish in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with the purpose of being a missionary to the black community, which was quite large there. He was given permission to perform all necessary services in English, but eventually returned to Jamaica, where he sought out Orthodox Christians and lectured extensively. Though somewhat of a failure in his personal life, he is yet another example of the fact that we seek out converts and are open to missionizing any group with whom we come into contact. From Poland, we have the hieromartyr St. Vasily Martys. He had attended the Kelm Seminary while St. Tikhon Belivin was the principal there, and so he was recruited due to his personal relationship with St. Tikhon. Immigrating to the United States in the year 1900, along with his wife, St. Vasily served throughout the United States and Canada before returning to Poland in 1912. He was later martyred in 1945 when brigands broke into his home and shot him. Another martyr under the socialists was St. Alexander Khodarkovsky. Arriving in the United States in 1895, he was particularly active in the mission to the Uniates in the United States and was instrumental in the construction of St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York City. He returned to Russia in 1914 and was present at the All-Russia Synod with the Patriarch St. Tikhon. After repeated arrests and suffering imprisonment and then exiles, St. Alexander Khodarkovsky was martyred by the socialists in 1937 by firing squad. His feast is celebrated December 4th. Father John Kirchhoff came to the United States in 1895 and was assigned to St. Vladimir's parish in Chicago, where he organized funds to build a proper Orthodox church. In all, he either founded or was instrumental in the founding of 7 parishes in the United States, 4 of which were in Illinois. He embarked on the translation of liturgical texts into English and then returned to Russia in 1907. He was arrested and shot by the socialists in 1917 and is considered to be the first martyr of the Russian Revolution. His memory is celebrated on October 31st. Yet another was the Bishop St. Arseny Chagovtsov of Winnipeg, who came to the United States in 1902. He was of special use ministering to Uniates throughout New York and Pennsylvania. While still a priest, Bishop Arseny founded St. Tikhon's Monastery in South Canaan, Pennsylvania. He was established as dean of the Canadian parishes in 1908, but returned to Russia in 1910 due to a hernia. He then was forced to flee to Yugoslavia in 1920 due to persecution by the socialists, and from there he was recalled to Canada in 1926, having already been consecrated a bishop in Yugoslavia. He retired to St. Tikhon's Monastery in Pennsylvania in 1937, and the following year he started the first classes at the seminary, where he taught off and on until his repose in 1945. The most explosive growth in North America, though, comes later on in the latter part of the 20th century, and that will be covered in another video in this series. It is important to note that the saints who labored in North America did so with limited funds and as refugees, oftentimes speaking limited English, but this did not stop them. Their parishes were typically spread over gigantic distances, and the communities they ministered to had either a small building or none at all. They brought together groups who were linguistically and culturally disparate, yet these missionaries sought to provide them with the divine liturgy and sacraments in languages that they could understand. The mission to the Uniates in Eastern Europe. Few missions of the Orthodox Church have spanned so many centuries and been so concerted as the mission to the Uniates. Though their conversion in North America formed an integral part of the missions in North America, that return was relatively small when compared to the larger movement of Uniates returning to the Church in Eastern Europe. It was also the most fruitful mission the Church embarked upon in the period between 1601 and 1917, and, most likely due to the length of time over which it occurred, it was the one in which every form and tactic of what might be considered missionary activity was experimented with. There were various attempts at Uniatism by the Catholic Church, such as the Second Council of Lyon and the Council of Florence, and from the Catholic point of view, the only true success of the Uniate movements was that with the Lebanese Maronites in 1182, because all of them came in at once and have stayed with Rome since joining, with no attempts at leaving. In Volume 1 of this series, we discussed the return of the Bulgarian Church to Orthodoxy in 1235, but it is worth reviewing here. In the year 1204, the Bulgarian Tsar Kalyan agreed to enter into communion with Rome and was crowned king of the Bulgarians by the papal legate. The union continued until 1234, when the new Tsar of Bulgaria, Ivan Asen II, went into an alliance with Byzantine Emperor Dukas Vatatzis. The following year, in 1235, at the Synod of Lampsacus, the ecumenical patriarch, with the permission of the other patriarchs, elevated the see of Tarnovo to that of a patriarchate, and once consecrated, it came back into the Orthodox Church. Now that the see of Tarnovo had been elevated to that of patriarchal status, they consecrated the Archbishop of Bulgaria, Germain, to patriarchal dignity. As can be seen on the map on screen, the Bulgarian Empire was much larger than modern-day Bulgaria, and this meant a sizable population of Uniate Catholics coming back into communion with the Orthodox Church. The largest and definitely most turbulent Unia, though, was that which created the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in 1596, when 8 of the 10 Ukrainian bishops, after promises of possessing equal legal status with the Polish bishops, entered a unia with Rome. For a detailed account of how this occurred and why, we highly recommend the work Crisis and Reform by Boris Gudziak, who is, at the time of the creation of this video, the head of the Ukrainian Catholic Diocese of Philadelphia. Though he is himself a Uniate, and despite the fact he includes in his analysis the standard Uniate arguments that the bishops were moved to communion with Rome due to the strength of the Orthodox lay brotherhoods, Gudziak also presents a substantial amount of additional information and motivations revealing the bishops were essentially power-hungry, politically ambitious, and were in the search of social prestige in a Catholic kingdom, while the zealously Catholic emperor, Sigismund III, was in dire need of a union in order to stabilize the country in the wake of major inroads made by the Protestant reformers. Further unions with the Catholics occurred among the Carpatho-Rusins, and individual bishops joined under the conditions outlined in the Synod of Brest-Litovsk. One of them, in 1646, was the Union of Uzhhorod, in which an initial 63 Orthodox priests with their bishop joined the Catholic Church, with the understanding they could keep their rites and traditions. Again, though this seems to have been motivated primarily out of the poverty with which the Orthodox Christians were relegated to, one of the concessions of the Austrians was that Uniate priests would receive the same legal rights as Catholic clergy. It took another century to convince the last of the local Orthodox clergy to join the Union of Uzhhorod, which by the mid-18th century had brought in several hundred Orthodox clergy. Unions of a similar nature took place in 1693 at Peremyshl, in 1700 at Lvov, and in 1702 at Lutsk. Now, an excellent and obsessively detailed work on the topic of the back-and-forth struggle between Orthodox and Uniates in Eastern Europe is Barbara Skinner's book, The Western Front of the Eastern Church, Uniate and Orthodox Conflict in 18th Century Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. In her book, Skinner makes abundantly clear that throughout this time, the oppression that the Orthodox faced was intense, government-sponsored, and enforced by Catholic clerics. She notes, quote, King Zygmunt III recognized the Uniate Church as the only legitimate Eastern Church in the Commonwealth, with full rights to perform its religious rites and services and to own church property. This in effect outlawed the Orthodox Church in the Commonwealth, and the king hoped that his stance would compel the anti-union elements to end their dispute, because King Zygmunt III accepted only the Uniate Church as the legitimate Eastern Rite Church, end quote. This was then briefly reversed in 1607 and 1609. In the midst of all this, Poland was supporting various pretenders to the Russian throne from 1598 through 1613 in the period known as the Time of Troubles. Poland then invaded Russia in 1608, and a Polish army besieged the St. Sergius Lavra for 16 months. The defenders, who were made up largely of armed monastics, fought the Poles off while taking heavy casualties themselves. With the St. Sergius Lavra under siege, Polish forces had seized Moscow in 1610 and then Smolensk in 1611. Sigmund of Poland placed his son on the Russian throne, but, encouraged by the Pope, he seized power himself in an attempt to convert Russia to Catholicism. It was in the Kremlin that the Poles held the Patriarch St. Hermoniges as prisoner. When he refused to order Russians to stand down and submit to the Poles, he was starved to death. Besieged in the Kremlin, the Polish army, in an ironic twist of fate, faced starvation themselves and were forced to resort to cannibalism. They surrendered the Kremlin in 1612, and half of them were promptly butchered by the Russian forces. The following year, Michael Romanov was chosen as Tsar, thereby commencing the Romanov dynasty, ending the Time of Troubles, and accomplishing most of the conquest of Siberia. Zygmunt III of Poland then tried to invade Russia once again in 1617, but by 1618, with the costs mounting and support from the parliament waning, Zygmunt signed a treaty with Russia, keeping Smolensk and Chernigov for Poland. What became clear is it was all an attempt by the fanatical Catholic Zygmunt III, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, to convert Russia to Catholicism, as he had, less than 2 decades prior in 1596, gone out of his way to orchestrate the Union of Brest, thereby creating the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Further, the political measures taken in the aftermath of the Union of Brest to pressure Orthodox to join the Unia, such as refusing to acknowledge the existence of the Orthodox Church in his realm, seizure of lands and churches, and demotion of Orthodox subjects from government positions, are further examples of Zygmunt's motives. In the aftermath of the war, the Commonwealth stepped up its efforts to force Catholicism onto its Orthodox Christian subjects, and most emblematic of this period was the Uniate Bishop of Polotsk, Josephat Kuntsevich, whom the Catholic Church has since canonized. Known for his religious observance and outward piety, Kuntsevich apostatized to the Unia as a young man and entered the Uniate order of the Basilian monks. As the majority of the Uniate episcopacy was recruited from the Basilians, Kuntsevich was eventually consecrated a bishop from where he used extreme brutality to enforce Catholicism. His methods were so brutal that he was actually censured by the Catholics and secular authority. In 1622, the Grand Chancellor of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Lew Safia, wrote to Kuntsevich stating, quote, "By the abuse of your authority and by your actions, which originate rather in vanity and personal hatred than in charity towards your neighbors, and are contrary to the laws of our country, you have kindled those dangerous sparks which may produce an all-consuming fire. Obedience to the laws of the country is more necessary than union with Rome. A general union can be promoted by charity only and not by force. You inform me that your life is in danger, but I think that it is your own fault. You say that you must seek defense against the agitators. Christ, being persecuted, did not seek for it, but prayed for his persecutors. So ought you likewise to act, instead of scattering offensive writings or uttering menaces, of which the apostles have left no example. Your sanctity assumes that you are permitted to despoil schismatics and to cut off their heads. The gospel teaches the contrary. This union has created great mischief. You offer violence to conscience, and you shut churches so that the Christians perish like infidels, without worship or sacraments. Whom have you converted to the Unia by your severities? You have alienated the hitherto loyal Cossacks. You have converted sheep into goats. You have drawn danger on the country, and perhaps even destruction on the Catholics. The Unia has not produced joy, but only discord, quarrels, and disturbance. It would have been much better if it had never taken place. Now, I inform you that by the king's command, the churches must be opened and restored to the Greeks, that they may perform divine services. We do not prohibit Jews and Mohammedans from having their places of worship, and yet you are shutting up Christian temples." End quote. Years before this, when several Uniate parishes reverted to Orthodoxy in Vitebsk, Belarus, Kuntsevich, in coordination with local government authorities who portrayed it as an insurrection, seized not just those parishes which had reverted, but all of the remaining Orthodox parishes in the area, while the, quote, rebels were executed. Situations like this were replicated throughout his reign of terror, but the final straw came when, in 1623, he discovered the Orthodox Christians in Vitebsk were meeting in secret for liturgy, so Kuntsevich had the priest arrested. The Orthodox peasants' long-suffering attitude finally snapped, and they broke into the bishop's palace, fought off the guards, and beat Kuntsevich to death, and then dragged his corpse through the streets, only to throw it finally into the river Dvina. In retaliation, 93 Orthodox Christians were killed for defending their right to freedom of worship, while many others were exiled, deprived of all their property, and all of the remaining Orthodox churches in the area were forcibly taken by the Uniates. The Ruthenian Orthodox believers vividly recalled actions like this and remembered them when the territory fell into Russian hands later on. Because 8 of the 10 Ruthenian bishops had signed on to the Union of Brest, in an act revealing extraterritorial jurisdiction, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Theophanes, who was returning to Constantinople from Moscow, stopped in Kiev and consecrated 7 bishops for the Orthodox in 1620. But he was forced to do so in secret, as the Commonwealth, with the help of figures like Josaphat Kuntsevich the Butcher, was forcing Catholicism onto the population. But in 1632, the king, in need of political support, gave the Orthodox Church the right to have their own hierarchs, as well as to build new churches and institutions. By 1640, St. Peter Mohila of Kiev published a preliminary catechism common among the average people, and later approved by the Council of Jassy in 1642. St. Peter also established high-quality theological schools to educate clergy, support the lay brotherhoods who controlled the printing presses, and was instrumental in keeping Orthodox Christianity alive in that region. In that regard, he is truly a pillar of orthodoxy. But were the Uniates doing any better under the thumb of Rome than they had been in the Orthodox Church? The answer is no. They were doing far worse. Larry Wolff, a professor of European history at New York University, writes a fantastic book entitled Disunion Within the Union, in which he discusses what life was like in the late 18th century for the Carpatho-Rusin, who became Uniates. Wolff is unabashed about their situation, stating that the promises made to the bishops about equality were rarely kept. Further, the Basilian order of monks, who were Uniates but extreme Latinizers, had been deeply infiltrated by Jesuits and were able to use their tremendous influence and wealth to obstruct every effort to keep authentic Byzantine liturgics and traditions. They produced most of the Uniate bishops, had a monopoly on education, and looked down their noses at their fellow Uniates, who were almost entirely of the peasant class. As Wolff points out, quote, "The struggle between the Basilian order and the parish priests was more than just intra-clerical combat, because the division of the Uniate clergy reflected the tremendous distance and virtual non-relation between the episcopal apex and the peasant masses at the top and bottom of the Uniate church. The Latin-leaning Basilians, ever since the Synod of Zamosk, were the elite pool from which bishops were chosen, while the secular priests, working farms, fulfilling feudal obligations, and supporting families, were culturally and socioeconomically close to the peasant laity who attended the parish churches." End quote. Wolff continues, quote, "The separation between elite and base was all the starker for the fact that the Uniate nobility had largely disappeared in the 17th century, drawn by the elite attraction of the Polish Roman Catholicism with or without the incitement of a Jesuit education. In the 18th century, the Uniate laity was almost entirely of the peasant class, farming at the miserable level of serfdom in the Commonwealth. This social circumstance was expressed in the pejorative Polish proverb wiara ruska, wiara chłopska, equating Ruthenian faith to Polish faith. Therefore, when the bishops finally had to look to their base in the late 18th century, they had to search right down to the bottom of society." End quote. The Latin hierarchy were also poaching whomever they could from the Uniates in attempt to see the extinction of the Byzantine Rite. This becomes no clearer than in the case of the Jesuits such as Benedict Herbest and Peter Skarga. According to Boris Gudziak, now Archbishop of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Diocese of Philadelphia, quote, "The idea of uniformity in rites and traditions, meaning Latinization or outright absorption of the Orthodox by the Roman Catholic Church, is presupposed in Herbest's attack on the Ruthenian Church." End quote. Skarga, Gudziak states, attacked not just the Ruthenian use of Church Slavonic, but everything about their rite and patrimony. Quote, Skarga eloquently presented his own thesis about union in his widely read On the Unity of the Church of God under One Shepherd and on the Greek Separation from that Unity, the first edition of which appeared in Vilnius in 1577 and was dedicated to the Palatine. In persuasive and passionate prose, Skarga sought to discredit the Ruthenian Byzantine patrimony, the religious ethos, and Orthodox ecclesiology. He attacked even the Ruthenian Church Slavonic language and the medium of Ruthenian cultural and religious expression. End quote. One might point out that this was written prior to the Union of Brest-Litovsk in 1596, but it ignores that these were guaranteed at the Council of Florence in 1439, and so the attitudes of Jesuits like Skarga and Herbest, which turned out to be almost universal among the throngs of Jesuits, and later Carmelites, active in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, sought a takeover and abolishment of the Ruthenian heritage under the guise of a union. It was a bait and switch, analogous to Catholic apologists waxing eloquently about the beauty of the Latin Mass and supposed clarity of the Catholic magisterium, but in a diocese of nearly 200 parishes, one might find one canonically licit Latin Mass, if any, and the magisterial authority of a pope's decrees are continually bickered about and then debated, making them difficult to neatly and easily place them into a clear magisterial category. So the convert who came in search of doctrinal clarity and Gregorian chant is, instead, stuck with Father Bob's folk guitar mass and wondering just how much authority the current pope's latest non-traditional sounding statements possess. So hard-pressed were the Orthodox by their Catholic rulers that from 1648 to 1657, a massive uprising occurred known as the Khmelnytsky Uprising, led by the Cossack commander Bohdan Khmelnytsky. It was at the very beginning of this rebellion that the great saint and hieromartyr, St. Athanasius of Brest-Litovsk, was taken out into the forest and martyred by the Jesuits for his resistance to the Unia, but his martyrdom was not to be in vain. Despite the fact the rebellion cost nearly 1 million lives as Orthodox Ukrainian peasants fought for their right to worship, they eventually won. It should be noted that the Catholic clergy were specifically targeted by the peasants and Cossacks, as Catholic clergy were the enforcers of the forced union, so this was very much a war for religious liberty on the part of the Orthodox. By 1667, roughly 70% of the Eastern Rite parishes in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were held by Orthodox Christians. That same year, a peace treaty granted Russia not only Kiev and Smolensk, but all territory east of the Dnieper River to Russia. In 1717, the Polish-Lithuanian Parliament forbade Orthodox Christians from building new churches, as well as repairing existing ones. They also forbade Orthodox and Protestants from holding any meetings, religious or secular. 3 years later, in 1720, the same year that the infamous Latinizing Synod of Zamosk was held by the Uniates, the Catholics attacked and took over the Pochev Monastery in what is now northwestern Ukraine, and exiled all of the Orthodox monks, thereby making it a Uniate monastery. By 1733, the Parliament forbade Orthodox Christians from holding any civil positions in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The situation had become so bad that in what is now Belarus, there was only one diocese left, and between 1721 and 1755, of the 290 Orthodox parishes in that one diocese, the Catholics had forcibly taken 165 of them, typically those in the best condition, and left the Orthodox with the remaining 130, most of which were already in poor repair due to laws forbidding their repair. But this began to change when a priest named Melchizedek Znaczko-Iworsky came to the western bank of the Dnieper River in 1745. He began preaching against the Unia and slowly bringing communities back into the Orthodox Church. His activities accelerated when, in 1757, Geraci Lincevci, a former missionary to China from 1745 to 1755, assumed the episcopate in Pereyaslav, just over the border into Russia. The Uniate bishop sent out one of his henchmen to first stop all Orthodox priests from crossing into the Commonwealth, second, to arrest Father Melchizedek in 1766, and third, to seize Orthodox parishes and monasteries. In 1767, the Commonwealth Parliament then decided it would exile anyone who converted from Catholicism to another faith. But it was when the Polish king and Russian Empress Catherine the Great agreed on making Orthodox Christians legally equal to Latin Catholics within the Commonwealth that another civil war erupted. The aggressors were a movement of fanatical Catholics known as the Confederation of Bar, who proclaimed their purpose was to cleanse the country of Moscow and heretics, as they saw Orthodox Christians being equal to them as an insult to Catholicism. Each side formed up their own militias, and the pent-up anger exploded when the Cossacks, supported by Ruthenian Orthodox serfs, retaliated against the fanatical coalition of Bar, sparking the year-long Kolivshnia rebellion that killed at least 100,000 people. Desperate to stop it, the Orthodox Bishop of Pereyaslav sent out orders condemning aggression, while the Russian military, supporting Polish forces, entered the fray in an attempt to control the situation, as they realized it would destabilize the region and could spill over into Russia. The ringleaders of both sides were executed, while thousands more were deported, but it led to the first of what would be 3 partitions of Poland, which was really a partitioning of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This commenced in 1772, when the Austrian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Russian Empire simply carved out respective shares of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, leaving a somewhat reduced and severely weakened Commonwealth in its place. As can be seen in the map on screen, the territory lost in the first partition was substantial. The historian Witold Kolbuk, as cited by Wolff and Skinner, states that there were roughly 4.6 million Uniates in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and roughly 400,000 Orthodox Christians on the eve of the first partition in 1772. Further, most of these were in the eastern section of the Commonwealth taken by Russia, with sizable populations of Uniates in the portion taken by Austria. So within their new territory, the Russians inherited a substantial number of Uniate subjects. The Russian Empress Catherine the Great was conniving and only publicly displayed religious sentiments, but she sought to merge the Uniates into the Orthodox Church for the same reason the Commonwealth had sought to create the Uniates in the first place, and the Latin Catholic hierarchy had sought to absorb them into the Latin Church thereafter. That is, their existence was seen as a threat to political stability by everyone around them. The existence of a vibrant Orthodox Church within the Commonwealth was seen as divisive to the Catholic hierarchy, and so the Unia was created, but once created, it became even more divisive than before, as it was now being attacked by two sides and not just by one. At the same time, by not assimilating into the Latin Rite, as figures such as Peter Skarga had insisted on, the Uniates were seen as anti-Polish, but by using Orthodox rites, while not being actual Orthodox Christians, the Russian Empire viewed them as being subversive and anti-Russian. Immediately after the first partition, a large portion of parishes voluntarily switched, as it seemed they had been only nominally Uniate, and in the first year, between 1,000 and 1,200 Uniate parishes came over in the region just west of Kiev, leaving around only 380 Uniate parishes in the same area. Many had previously been Orthodox, but under Polish violence, they had officially joined the Unia. At the same time, Catherine's policies vacillated between, on the one hand, outright apathy to the point of obstructing Uniates from joining the Orthodox Church, all the way to heavy-handed pressure, and at times outright coercion, to the point of allowing soldiers to publicly beat Uniate priests until they handed over the keys to their parishes, or exiling ones who would not convert. The beatings of Uniate priests seems to have been done with the understanding that the particular parishes had been Orthodox within recent memory, but had been seized by the Uniates, the Uniate clergy being the main instigators of this. Tactics like that, though, do not encourage people to stay. But, and it should be no surprise to anyone, despite the fact the official conversions were spectacularly high, when Catherine obtained what she wanted politically from Rome, or Poland, or Austria, she lapsed back to a policy of complete apathy, and segments of the Uniates would go back, such as occurred 1 year after the partition in 1773. In the book, The Western Front of the Eastern Church, Skinner states that in one region of Fastiv, near Kiev, of 20 Orthodox parishes that returned to the Unia between 1773 and 1778, only 3 did so voluntarily, with the other 17 returning to the Unia only because of military and legal threats issued against them if they did not return. As Skinner points out, quote, once the Russian military was no longer encamped in the right bank and no longer protecting orthodoxy, the general population seemed to be willing to proclaim its acceptance of union, if only to be left in peace by the Polish troops and authorities. Only the population of the border regions of Smila, Kiehyrin, and Cherkasy, that had been bolstered by Melchizedek's assistance in the 1760s, remained dedicated to orthodoxy in name as well as deed. End quote. Following this, Catherine's policy was that any Uniate parish which wanted to convert would have to petition the Russian Holy Synod in order to be allowed to. Such a laborious process slowed down the rate of conversion significantly, but ensured higher quality converts were being brought into the church. Skinner also points out the political dynamic and just how ubiquitous violence was. Quote, both sides also had a recent record of violence, with Russian soldiers defending the Orthodox jurisdiction and the Polish military assisting the expansion of Uniate jurisdiction. The methods of intimidating and expelling priests, at times violently accosting them, and constantly threatening violence were nearly the same. Each side had served the role of perpetrator of violence, and each the role of victim, but each made claims that it alone had been victimized. End quote. Initially, soldiers would often need to be brought in, as a common situation was that the congregation desired to switch, but the priest, who was naturally the most dedicated to the Unia, wanted to remain in the Unia. So the Russian soldiers, who were often acting as the local police force, would arrive and demand the keys be relinquished. If the priest refused, they would be forcibly taken. But most parishioners aren't encouraged when they see their priest, whether they like his views or not, being beaten. Acts like this make persons who were intent on converting now wanting nothing to do with the Russian authorities or their church. It was perhaps in response to this fact that when Catherine came out of her period of apathy and decided to rededicate herself to converting the Uniates, she used a new tactic. Whenever a vacancy in a Uniate parish occurred, the congregation would be polled on whether they wanted an Orthodox priest or a Uniate priest. That tactic garnered around 120,000 converts in Belarus during the 1780s as it circumvented obstinate priests and thereby avoided brutality. In 1793, the second partition of Poland occurred, and Russia now found itself ruling over 1.7 million more Uniates in the new territory. But this time, the Russians were organized on the advice of the Greek bishop of Kherson, Archbishop Eugenius Vulgaris, and the Russians used a different strategy. Quote, in contrast to the piecemeal and limited conversion efforts within the Belarusian provinces of the first partition, Catherine's 1794 policy targeting the Uniate parishes of the second partition was deliberate and far-reaching. Archbishop Vulgaris rejected strategies of using force, calling a church council, or using verbal and written persuasion as either offensive or ineffective. He recommended instead, 1. Sending well-trained Orthodox priests to Uniate parishes to win converts through their own exemplary actions and words, 2. Creating schools for children of the non-Orthodox population with qualified teachers to promote Orthodoxy, and 3. Issuing manuals of instruction that would lay out the dogmatic arguments in a simple and straightforward manner. End quote. This time, the results were beyond spectacular and involved only sporadic resistance. By early 1796, the official record states that 1.6 million of the Uniates in the territory of the second partition had converted, leaving roughly 100,000 remaining Uniates within the same territory. In 1795, a similar plan was envisioned for the territory seized in the third partitions, but Catherine died at the end of 1796, and her son, who could not have cared less about the Uniates, did not pursue the policy. The total number of converts who actually stuck with it is hard to pin down, and Larry Wolff disagrees on the numbers, believing instead that during the entire period from 1768 to 1804, only about 1.4 million Uniates converted and stayed Orthodox, while about the same number remained Uniate. Another 1.8 million were in the former Commonwealth territory of Galicia, now controlled by Catholic Austria. Even then, that would mean that in a 36-year period, 1.4 million Uniates had converted. But in 1830, a rebellion centered in Warsaw began against the rule of the Tsar, and though it was quickly put down, the Russian government discovered some of the Uniate clergy, and most notably the Basilian monks, had aided in the rebellion. In response, numerous Uniate monasteries and parishes were ordered to be shut down. Interestingly enough, though, the Russians decided that in order for Uniate parishes to reopen, they needed to be cleansed of Latin influence. This meant pipe organs, confessionals, pews, and statuaries were to be removed, while iconostases were installed. The initiatives met with little to no resistance in the majority of the Uniate parishes, as most seemed to like the pro-Byzantine rite. By 1839, the Uniate metropolitan Joseph Samoshko had gathered signatures from the Uniate clergy demonstrating that 98% of them in Belarus and Lithuania wanted to break with Catholicism and reunite with the Orthodox Church. And so that very same year, by the decision of the Council of Polotsk, Metropolitan Joseph, along with 2 other bishops, and 1.6 million Uniates, comprising 1,600 parishes, were received into the Orthodox Church. This then made for at least 3 million Uniates who had converted since 1768. Years later, in 1871, the Catholic bishop of the Diocese of Kelm in Poland ran away without first seeking the Pope's approval. With Rome refusing to install a new bishop and in need of a cleric to administer the diocese, the Russian government took the highest-ranking Uniate clergyman present, Father Marcel Papiel, who was head of the diocesan Uniate Seminary, and made him the diocesan administrator. Father Papiel was a widower, originally from Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and like most Galician priests, was ardent that the parishes needed to be authentically Byzantine. The reason for this is when the Austro-Hungarian Empire took over the region of Galicia, which is now in western Ukraine and southern Poland, the Austrian leadership created its own seminary system that was independent of the papacy. Now, this absolutely infuriated the papacy, as they were unable to exert control over it, and it worked in the favor of the Uniates, who were able to educate their own priests and retain traditional Byzantine liturgics and piety. This was especially true under the extremely Catholic Maria Theresa, who was Empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire from 1740 to 1780. The same system was continued under her own successors. The Russians then quite literally imported Byzantine Catholic priests from the Austro-Hungarian Empire to implement the same liturgics they had learned in the Byzantine Catholic seminaries run by the Austrian crown. In fact, when the Bishop of Kelm fled to Galicia with anywhere from 70 to 100 priests, they were not welcomed by the local Uniates purely because they were too Latinized. Now, Father Marcel Papiel was in the position to implement within the Kelm diocese what had been going on elsewhere in Russian holdings under the supervision of Uniate priests from Galicia, the restoration of Byzantine liturgics via de-Latinization. Confessionals, monstrances, stations of the cross, Eucharistic adoration, pews, pipe organs, and anything else belonging to the Latin tradition were removed from the Uniate parishes. In his encyclical Omnem Sollicitudinem, Pope Pius IX condemned the reforms that sought authenticity within the Byzantine Catholic rite. He states, quote, "At the same time, these canons have solemnly declared that no one whosoever, without consultation with this Holy See, may introduce even the slightest innovations into the liturgy. This is sufficiently and clearly indicated in the apostolic constitutions mentioned earlier. Liturgical innovations of this nature, proposed for the purpose of purifying the Oriental rites and restoring them to their pristine integrity, are a pretext and therefore invalid. Indeed, the liturgy of the Ruthenians can be no other than that which was either instituted by the Holy Fathers of the Church, or ratified by the canons of synods, or introduced by legitimate use, always with the express or tacit approval of the Apostolic See. If variations have occurred in this liturgy in the course of time, they have been instituted after consultation with the Roman pontiffs, and for the express purpose of freeing such rites from any taint of heresy or schism, and expressing Catholic teaching more correctly and clearly for the preservation of the faith and the good of souls. Accordingly, nothing other is intended by the deceptive pretext of purifying rites and restoring them to their original condition than the preparation of pitfalls for the faith of the Ruthenians of Kelm, whom evil men are striving to tear from the bosom of the Church and to hand over to heresy and schism." End quote. And, as if he is completely and utterly tone-deaf, the Pope then continues, quote, "But among all our distressing difficulties, we are refreshed by the truly heroic display of bravery and constancy of spirit which the Ruthenians of the Diocese of Kelm have recently offered before God, angels, and men. They rejected the iniquitous orders of the pseudo-administrator, preferring to endure every ill, even extreme danger to their own lives, rather than to reject their ancestral faith and to give up the Catholic rites which they desire to preserve forever incorrupt and intact." End quote. So on the one hand, restoring a rite is a, quote, "innovation," end quote. Yet the Latinizing innovations the Pope approved of somehow make the liturgy to be, quote, "incorrupt and intact," end quote. The mental gymnastics necessary to reason through this are impressive, and it is not surprising that they come from the same Pope who insisted on proclaiming as dogma an idea as dangerously centralizing as papal infallibility. It should also be noted that less than a century later, the Second Vatican Council endorsed the very liturgical reforms Pius IX is here decrying and condemning. Furthermore, Pius IX does not condemn the Austrian crown for doing the same thing because they had substantial power over the papacy to the point of possessing a veto over papal elections. And so, in this union within the Kelm diocese, which took place in 1875, about 400,000 of the local Uniates went into communion with Moscow, albeit about two-thirds of them returned to the Catholic Church 30 years later, in 1905, but as Latin Catholics, not Uniates. Such a wholesale return of converted Uniates was out of the ordinary and highly unique to the Kelm diocese. Even the returns that occurred after the first partition of Poland in 1772 were relatively small compared to this. It appears, though, that the reason had to do with them being more comfortable with Latinized liturgics in a space that was essentially a Latin church. The parishes in Kelm were, compared to other areas, extraordinarily Latinized. In fact, they were essentially Tridentine parishes in that they had side altars, statuaries, confessionals, communion rails, altars that were often pushed up against the wall, but no iconostases. In fact, when the delatinization was being implemented by Uniate priests from Galicia, it was the only region in which there was resistance to delatinization. But the fact that when these Uniates returned to Catholicism, that they returned to the Latin Rite, was due almost entirely to the Catholic hierarchy itself, which sought to suppress rites outside of the Roman Rite. In the video description below, there is a link to an article entitled Trapped Between Two Churches, Orthodox and Greek Catholics Within Eastern Poland. Written by the Byzantine Catholic priest Father Sergei Kelleher, he argues exactly what is being argued here, but in far greater detail and with pertinent documentation. We encourage anyone who doubts what is being said here to consult with that article. A common accusation against Father Papiel is that he lived in open concubinage, but in researching for this video, we have been unable to locate any reliable information on this, and considering he was head of the Uniate Seminary and an extremely conservative society, it appears unlikely. More likely than not, and hearkening back to the incident between Bishop John Ireland and St. Alexis Toth, the Latin hierarchy, despising the practice of married priests and, more often than not recognizing their marriages, simply started the accusation as a reference to Father Marcel having been married. Another figure who was instrumental in bringing not only Uniates, but also Lutherans into the Orthodox Church is Saint Filaret Gumilevsky, who, as Bishop of Riga in Latvia from 1841 to 1848, oversaw the conversion of up to 100,000 Estonian and Latvian Uniates and Protestants to Orthodox Christianity. Now, it is often alleged that the Russian government forced these reunions or installed those who were pro-reunion, but most of the evidence actually points to the fact that starting in the early 1800s with Catherine the Great's successor, Tsar Paul I, the Russian government showed little interest in converting the Uniates. Even later on, in the latter part of the 19th century, according to the official report of Russia's Conference on Uniate Affairs from 1874, it was actually extremely hesitant, if not outright averse, to the idea of accepting Uniates into the Church, even on an individual basis. The tactic of strong-arming Uniates into returning had essentially been abandoned after 1773, and had the Russian government been strong-arming Uniates into returning, one would expect to not see the same type of mass movements of Uniates back into the Orthodox Church outside the Russian Empire. But, in fact, we see Uniates, specifically Carpatho-Russins, both in North America and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, converting to Orthodoxy en masse. We have already covered the story of their return in North America, but in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was figures such as Archimandrite Vladimir Terlecki and Saint Alexis Kabliuk who were instrumental in this conversion. Archimandrite Vladimir Terlecki was a Uniate priest who converted to Orthodoxy in Kiev in 1872, and he began working amongst Uniates to bring them back into the church. He had to do this from Kiev because, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time, it was against the law to convert to Orthodoxy, and that is where the problem started for the village of Iza in the northeast of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1903, they announced their desire to return to the Orthodox Church. And almost immediately, a police station was built in their village and arrested 22 men for treason. Their priest, Father Joachim Vakarov, was tortured and killed, which then inspired the villages of Luchki and Toroblia to also leave the Unia. So desperate were these people for Orthodox sacraments that they would even sneak across the border into Romania for baptisms, marriages, and occasional liturgies rather than accept the Unia. St. Alexis Kabliuk, the apostle to the Carpatho-Russians, himself a former Uniate, converted to Orthodoxy in 1908. He was repeatedly jailed by the Austrians for his work amongst his fellow co-religionists, but was continually supported by the great Russian Archbishop Anthony Kropovitsky. In the area around the village of Iza, in what is now the far west of Ukraine, 14,000 Uniates returned to the church due to the efforts of Saint Alexis. But undaunted, he then established 28 Orthodox parishes and missions throughout this area. The Austro-Hungarian authorities replied by jailing converts to Orthodoxy, closing parishes, ransacking homes, and taking devotional material while they searched for Father Alexis. His entire extended family was arrested, and the Hungarian police began suspending converts to Orthodoxy from trees as a form of torture, taking them down only when on the brink of death. In another case, the police arrested and tortured 11 nuns, forcing them to walk naked through the streets during the winter day after day for 3 months straight, yet all of them stayed steadfast. During this time, Saint Alexis was arrested and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, while roughly 100 men were sentenced to 3.5 years with him. Bearing all of this in mind, all this did was spur even more Uniates to convert to Orthodoxy. In 1919, Father Alexis was freed from prison. The Austro-Hungarian Empire no longer existed, and his flock was spread between several nations. Now able to worship more freely, Father Alexis increased his missionary efforts and was instrumental in establishing the Mukachevo-Prešov diocese, which by 1936 alone had 127 churches and 140,000 believers, almost all of whom were former Uniates. The movement that he started in that area would have broad implications, because before his death in 1947, a total of more than 1,000 local Uniate parishes in the region would convert. He reposed in the Lord in 1947, and his relics are housed at St. Nicholas Monastery in Iza. His feast day is celebrated both on October the 21st and on December 2nd. In the same period of time, in 1926 in Tilawa, Poland, 50,000 people belonging to the Lempko group of Carpatho-Rusins petitioned the Russian Orthodox Church to receive them. All of this was started by the hieromartyr St. Maxim Sandovich, who had himself become a Uniate. St. Maxim entered the Basilian monastery at the age of 15, but after being dissatisfied with the poor quality of the spiritual life there, he left at the age of 16 and went to Russia, where he converted to Orthodox Christianity and entered the Pochev Lavra. He became friends with Metropolitan Anthony Kropovitsky, who was directing the mission to the Uniates in Galicia, and attended seminary, deciding instead to become a married priest. At the age of 23, St. Maxim was married, ordained, and returned to Galicia, where due to his missionary endeavors, he was repeatedly fined and twice arrested for providing Orthodox sacraments. It was his second arrest that resulted in being placed before an Austrian firing squad, where his pregnant wife and parents saw him executed in 1914. His feast day is celebrated on September the 6th. Even under the Soviets, there was a movement back to Orthodoxy under figures such as Father Gabriel Kostelnik, who was professor of theology and philosophy at the Uniate Seminary of Lvov and was fluent in Serbo-Croat, Ukrainian, German, Latin, and Polish. He was involved in the controversial and largely Soviet-organized Council of Lvov in 1946, in which the Union of Brest-Litovsk was rejected. Though that is often used against him and accusations that he was acting out of self-interest are sometimes brought up, it should be noted that 15 years before the Council of Lvov, Father Gabriel was relieved of his post at the Uniate Seminary for publishing an article in which he openly declared that he believed the Uniates needed to return to the Orthodox Church. In 1946, Father Gabriel and a dozen fellow priests were accepted into communion with the Orthodox Church by the Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev. When the Soviets persecuted the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, just as the Soviets had and were doing to all of the Orthodox churches, especially the Russian Orthodox Church, almost 1,000 or nearly 80% of Uniate clergy in the western half of Ukraine sought refuge in the Orthodox Church along with their flocks, and most of their descendants have stayed to this day. Regardless of whether or not these actions were backed by the Soviet regime, the fact remains that we were willing to accept these people into the Church, all while undergoing the most horrendous persecutions in Christian history. A persecution that took at least 20 million lives, including the lives of over 106,000 clergymen across Eastern Europe in just a matter of a few decades. It is hard to know direct numbers, but between 1772 and the early 20th century, it seems that once apostates are removed from these totals, somewhere around 3.5 million Uniates converted and stayed Orthodox in Eastern Europe and in North America. The mission to the Uniates in the Eastern Mediterranean. Though the attempts at establishing unions at the Second Council of Lyon and the Council of Florence had failed at establishing a union, both councils had laid out a pattern along which the unia could be established, and though those unions were dead on arrival, there were attempts to enforce the Council of Florence in a substantial number of islands in the Eastern Mediterranean, mostly inhabited by Greeks, but ruled by Venice, such as Crete, Corfu, Limnos, the Cyclades Islands, and the Ionian Islands, among others. Their populations also consisted of colonies of Venetians, Genoese, French, and any number of Western European nations with large trade colonies. Oftentimes, only a Latin hierarchy was allowed on these islands, so long as they were controlled by Western powers, but when the Ottomans conquered them, they occasionally allowed the Latin hierarchy to stay, but typically allowed the Greek hierarchy to return if they had been expelled earlier. Over time, the Greek Church received in not only those Greeks who had been baptized, confirmed, and communed as Roman Catholics for anywhere from several decades to a few centuries, but also gradually absorbed all those Westerners who did not flee. Cyprus is a prime example. It was invaded by Richard the Lionheart in 1191. He then sold it to the Templars shortly thereafter. The Kingdom of Cyprus was then established by a French line of nobility, and in 1489, it was sold to Venice. During the Catholic occupation, usually only a few of the 14 sees were inhabited by Orthodox hierarchs, and these Orthodox bishops were forced into the villages by the Latin Catholic hierarchy, who had the rule of law over them. It was an incredibly difficult time for the Orthodox Christians on Cyprus. For further reading, a standard work on this period of time is Chrysovalanti Kyriakou's work, Cyprus under the Latins. It was only in 1571 that the island was finally conquered by the Ottomans, at which point, close to 400 years of Catholic rule came to a swift end. In the following centuries, the Orthodox Church quite simply absorbed the Catholics, whether Latin or Byzantine Rite, as well as a sizable number of Maronite Catholic settlers on the island, only a handful of whom exist today. The Arab Levant, specifically modern-day Syria and Lebanon, was another area that has been heavily under assault by the Uniates. Starting in the year 1625, Carmelites and Jesuits founded schools and began seeking converts who would publicly remain Orthodox while secretly converting to Catholicism. The Catholic missionaries' hope was that some of these individuals would be able to work their way into the episcopate and thereafter lead their flocks en masse into union with Rome. The missionaries had attempted to woo hierarch after hierarch, and in some cases had been successful. But when one reads the missionaries' glowing correspondence with their superiors in Europe, correspondence that spoke of Orthodox bishops falling over themselves to convert, but avoiding doing so supposedly for fear of the Turks, one should realize that these same bishops were taking funding from France while simultaneously refusing to sign letters of submission to Rome. It is obvious the missionaries were either being duped or the hyped-up reports were simply an attempt by the missionaries to keep their missions from being defunded. In his excellent work, Arab Orthodox Christians under the Ottomans, 1516 to 1831, Konstantin Panchenko comments on this phenomena, stating, quote, "Repeated statements by Western missionaries of the 16th and 17th centuries about the readiness of the Orthodox Syrians to reunite with the Apostolic See of Rome and accept Latin dogmas seem to have been far from reality. Catholic historiography, distinguished by its exalted historical optimism, was inclined to declare all Middle Eastern bishops to be supporters of union, except those who officially declared Latin dogma to be anathema. Perhaps Latin missionaries exaggerated their success in dealing with the Orthodox East. Perhaps they were mistaken, taking at face value the refined Middle Eastern sense of respect, etiquette of dialogue, and code of hospitality." End quote. Panchenko later makes another point just as poignant, stating, quote, "As has already been noted, the Arabs did not invest the same meaning in their words of fraternal unity with the See of Rome in these statements as Catholics saw in them." End quote. This becomes even clearer when one contrasts it with the reality on the ground. The merchant class was interested in converting, but, as Robert Haddad points out in his book, Syrian Christians in Muslim Society, and as is echoed in Panchenko's book, their conversion was due largely to four factors. The first was identical to the reason why most of the Ruthenian bishops signed on to the Unia at the Council of Brest-Litovsk: social mobility. But this social mobility did not require them to completely abandon their ancestral ways, as conversion to Islam would have required. Quote, "For it was not until the objects of Latin proselytizing were reasonably convinced that entry into the Unia would, through the European and certain local Syrian connections obtained, thereby provide them with a range of possibility which adhesion to their ancestral faith could not, that large numbers of them declared openly for Rome. By 1700, such was the case, and for the first time, the Syrian Christian in search of an added measure of security and material advantage possessed an alternative to conversion to Islam." End quote. The second reason why the upper class was more prone to accepting the Unia was economic interests, specifically economic interests with France, which was the dominant navy in the Mediterranean at the time. Haddad states, quote, "Nor was the effectiveness of the missionary unrelated to economic considerations. For as the 17th century drew to a close, the Melkite men of commerce, the lay leadership, a few of them mission-educated, whether as clients of European merchants of moving towards a more independent position, had grown acutely aware of the advantages of consular protection and no less aware of the intimate connection between consular protection and membership in the Unia." End quote. The third reason was tied closely to the second one. Conversion to Catholicism allowed one to fly a Catholic flag on one's vessels, thereby making them largely immune to European corsairs who were primarily in the service of Catholic nations. Quote, "Unleashed for the most part from Malta, these latter-day crusaders, though devoted ostensibly to undoing exclusively infidel shipping, in practice tended to plunder any vessel ungraced by the pavilion of a Catholic prince. Now, insofar as any in Syria could influence the corsairs, they were the representatives of the very Christian king, and inevitably, the Syrian Christian, whose property was exposed to the depredations of the corsairs, or who sought restitution of property already plundered by them, made his way to the French consuls. The consuls, in effect, then referred him to the missionaries, for the tacit price of French intervention in these matters was unquestionable submission to Rome. By 1702, the consuls, with the blessings of Versailles, were issuing to Uniates certificates which noted the fact of their Catholicism and the nature of the merchandise charged to their accounts." End quote. Fourth, prior to the establishment of massive numbers of schools by foreign-funded missionaries, the educational opportunities available to the average Arab Christian were rare. In the struggle to survive under the heavy hand of Islam, education, and most importantly, Christian education, among the Arab Christians had fallen to epic lows due simply to a lack of resources and social stability. It had created a situation in which Christians had, by and large, lost any sense of theology mixed in with random outbursts of cultural exclusivity. Quote, "On all sides, the death of theological speculation and the meager learning of the clergy had reduced many questions of doctrine to near irrelevance. We know that the early 1540s had witnessed an attempt at union between the Maronite and Melkite churches, an attempt which it would seem was frustrated less by doctrinal divergence than by the opposition of the great church, and perhaps by Ottoman uneasiness over an arrangement which threatened to bring within a single fold the semi-autonomous mountaineers and the most numerous Christian elements of urban Syria. We know, too, that the Melkite church could, in the 1580s, spawn a patriarch who had never heard of the Council of Florence, and that, as late as 1650, the Uniate Maronites were led by a prelate who promised excommunication to any of his flock who made his confession before a Latin priest. At the same time, and perhaps as a byproduct of the losses and dislocation of the Mamluk period, the sense of difference among the generality of Syrian Christians had yielded in some measure to an awareness of the advantages of cooperation in face of the unitary Muslim temporal power to which they were in common subjection. In 1659, a Melkite patriarch, returned from 7 years in the lands of the Christians, was greeted on the edge of Aleppo by Christians of all sects, prelates of one communion were known to use their good offices to settle disputes arising with one another, and at least on the great feasts and other special occasions, the laity and clergy of one sect were known to frequent the churches of the others. Throughout most of the 17th century, then, there is little indication that the Latins were regarded by the Melkites as a threat. End quote. So then the real reasons for the Unia in the Middle East become clear. Not conviction, but desperation and material interests. With that in mind, the Latin missionaries had succeeded in creating two rival factions within the Patriarchate of Antioch, a truly Orthodox faction on the one hand, and a pro-Catholic faction on the other. Signs of this began to appear in 1683 when the Bishop of Tyre and Sidon, Euthemius Saifi, made a Catholic profession of faith in secret. 2 years later, in 1685, Bishop Athanasius Dabas of Sednaia obtained a degree from the Ottoman authorities stating that he was to be patriarch over and against the existing patriarch Cyril Zaim, who had been elected 12 years earlier. 4 years later, in 1687, Dabas made a Catholic profession of faith as well, but by 1694, and due to third-party arbitration, he backed away from his claim, leaving Cyril Zaim with the agreements that upon Zaim's death, Dabas would be made patriarch. Zaim, in turn, made a Catholic profession of faith in 1716, and 2 years later, in 1718, Euthemius Saifi was deposed by the ecumenical patriarch Jeremiah III, but the Patriarch of Antioch, Cyril Zaim, ignored it. In 1720, Patriarch Cyril Zaim died, but instead of Dabas being able to take the patriarchal throne, as he had been promised, Euthemius Saifi insisted that he be made Patriarch of Antioch. As odd as it was, two Catholics were now locked in a struggle over the office of Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, but Dabas held the day, as he had the support of the French. Dabas then excommunicated and exiled the already excommunicated Euthemius Saifi to southern Turkey, who died the following year. What was becoming a pattern was that in order to gain the support of the wealthy merchant class in the Levant, who leaned heavily Catholic for the reasons given above, as well as to obtain support from the French, who held disproportionate levels of power at the Ottoman court, pretenders to the Patriarchate of Antioch were making Catholic professions of faith as a political move, but then saw themselves as still in communion with the Orthodox Church, which bothered neither the Catholic missionaries nor the Vatican. One might wonder how they could have done this, but it must be recalled that the French crown was not actually practicing an Orthodox Catholicism. Rather, the French crown espoused Gallicanism, an ecclesiology that might best be described as almost French Anglicanism, which downplayed the papacy, stating instead that the Pope required the permission of the bishops to rule on dogma, and, therefore, the Pope could really only act as a ratifier within an ecumenical council, much like a prime minister within a parliamentary system. Due to their intense study of history, the Gallicans had developed an ecclesial model similar to the Orthodox Christian model. Further, the Gallicans laughed at the idea of papal infallibility, which was at that time simply a theological opinion within Catholicism. They referred to it and its supporters as ultramontanes, or those from across the mountains, meaning Italians, a group whom the French looked down upon as backward and uneducated peasants. So strong was Gallicanism that Vatican I was called specifically to denounce it. Due to its promotion by the French crown, Gallicanism was the type of Catholicism present in any area French missions were running, and the French were the dominant missionary force, not only in the Arab Levant, but in the Catholic world. So it is not too difficult to see why there were so many hierarchs willing to accept Catholicism. The French missionaries were presenting them with a version of it that was fairly similar to Orthodoxy, save for the filioque and purgatory, which probably sounded more like minor opinions in theology, far beyond human comprehension, to the typically poorly educated and always resource-strapped Arab hierarchs. The Patriarch Athanasius III Dabas, though, did not last long in Catholic communion, and on his deathbed in 1724, Dabas named as his successor the strongly pro-Orthodox priest Sylvester. But Euthemius Saifi's legacy lived on, as his nephew, a priest by the name of Seraphim Taunus, contested the election of Sylvester, and it is Taunus, better known as Cyril VI Taunus, who is the first patriarch of the Byzantine Catholic Patriarchate of Antioch. The issues that surround the election of Taunus are simple. First, the Synod of Antioch neither elected nor accepted him. Second, Taunus was consecrated by bishops Neophytus Nasri of Sednaya, Basil Finas of Banyas, and Euthemius Fadl of Malula. There was just one gigantic problem. Canon law requires 3 bishops for a consecration, and while Taunus had 3 consecrators, his consecrators did not count because Fadl had been consecrated by Finan, and Nasri with no 3rd bishop, while Finan had been consecrated by Nasri alone. One might flee to the excuse that desperate times call for desperate measures. But if Taunus needed 3 bishops to consecrate him, why did Finan and Fadl not require the same? Further, the 3 consecrators had no mandate from Rome, and so were acting on their own initiative, which is part of the reason Rome did not accept Taunus as the patriarch for nearly 6 years. The strongly pro-Orthodox Sylvester, who had been the chosen successor of the previous patriarch, Athanasius Dabas, did have the support of the majority of the Holy Synod and the other patriarchates, but he had a rough personality, and membership continued to hemorrhage to the point that all of the Aleppo was Uniate, while Beirut and Damascus went largely to the Uniates. The situation stayed put until the year 1846, when the Byzantine Catholic Bishop Macarius of Amida, which is modern-day Diyarbakir in Turkey, converted to Orthodoxy, bringing most of his flock with him. Further, in 1858, the Pope mandated the Uniate switch to the Gregorian calendar, causing a schism within the Uniate ranks. Suddenly, there was a pro-Orthodox party within the ranks of the Unia, and they then contacted Russia, desiring to create an autocephalous church distinct from the Antiochian Patriarchate, but within the Antiochian Patriarchate's territory. Realizing this would cause even more chaos, the Russians declined, and insisted the pro-Orthodox Uniates reconcile with Antioch. They mostly did, and so, in the late 1850s and up until the early 1860s, around 50,000 Catholics, both Latin and Byzantine Rite, were accepted into the Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch by chrismation and signing a profession of Orthodox faith. As mentioned, the 4th reason why so many Orthodox became Uniate in the first place was due to the fact the Catholics opened schools and took in pupils from all Christian sects. There, they would teach the children Roman Catholic theology, and when those children came of age, they were therefore disproportionately more likely to join the Unia, and so the system of Catholic schools were really the main weapon in the arsenal of Catholic missionaries. Though attempts were made by the Orthodox to combat this trend by establishing schools of their own, most attempts were fleeting due to the lack of financial support. Figures such as Jacob of Patmos, who before dying in 1765 established several theological schools in Syria and Palestine, was by far the most educated of these figures. Students in his schools were usually destined to a career in the hierarchy of the Church, as the curriculum included Greek, Classical Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew, followed by theology and philosophy, mathematics, rhetoric, and grammar. He was assisted by Ephraim the Athenian, who later became the Metropolitan of Bethlehem and then Patriarch of Jerusalem, and Sophronius the Syrian, who also was a future Patriarch of Jerusalem. Yet another disciple and later assistant of Jacob of Patmos, who also went on to be a Patriarch of Jerusalem, was a convert from Nestorianism named Anthimus. Fluent not only in Arabic and Persian from his youth, he acquired fluency in Turkish and Greek and used the Patriarchate's limited resources to support the few schools that existed. There is also Nikiforos Theotoki. Originally from the Greek island of Corfu, he was university educated at Bologna and Padua in modern-day Italy, followed by a time in Leipzig in modern-day Germany. For several years, he taught in the Holy Land, but eventually moved to Russia in 1776, where he was involved in missions to the Old Believers before reposing in 1800. Despite these sincere and sacrificial efforts, they were a small trickle compared to the system the Catholic missionaries were able to establish due to being bankrolled largely by the French crown. For example, in the mid-19th century, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem only operated 2 schools in Jerusalem for the nearly 30,000 Orthodox Christians there, but an archimandrite by the name of Porphyry arrived and opened several schools for the local Arabs. By 1852, the Jerusalem Patriarchate entrusted Archimandrite Porphyry with the management of all of the schools it possessed, and, The archimandrite also ensured that an Arabic catechism and lectionary were printed. Succeeding him in 1858 was Bishop Kirill Naumov, who was tasked with continuing the strengthening of Arab clergy in terms of both education and establishing charities to benefit the Arab Orthodox Christians. It was Naumov who then took the mission throughout the entirety of the Levant and northern Egypt. In 1865, Archimandrite Antonin Kapustin took over the Russian ecclesiastical mission in Palestine, and it grew exponentially. He purchased numerous properties, such as the Oak of Mamre, where he consecrated a hostel for pilgrims. Another parcel of land, this one on the Mount of Olives, was purchased, and the Ascension of the Lord Church was built upon it. He acquired an olive tree grove outside Jerusalem, both establishing a convent and building the Kazan icon of the Mother of God Church there, and then built St. Mary Magdalene's Parish on Gethsemane, which is where the relics of the martyred Grand Duchess St. Elizabeth Fedorovna lay at rest. Archimandrite Antonin also established various schools in the area around Jerusalem for the Arab Orthodox Christians. After centuries of missionary work in the Levant, the Catholic Church ran 368 educational institutions catering to more than 22,000 students by 1890. In the same year, Protestant schools, which had been at work for about a century and dotted the land, catered to around 15,000 students. After about 70 years of work, in 1909, though, the Russian Orthodox Church ran 102 educational centers with just over 11,500 students and 2 institutions to train teachers, one in Nazareth and one outside Bethlehem. What this did was stem the tide of Orthodox going into the Unia, or into Protestantism. The Russian Church was also building churches in Jerusalem, Gethsemane, Cana, Hebron, Mount Carmel, and Jaffa. 6 hospitals were built in Damascus and Homs in Syria, and in Nazareth and Bethlehem in Palestine. These treated roughly 60,000 patients per year. Furthermore, an orphanage for Orthodox children and a home for elderly women were established under Archimandrite Leonid Sentsov, who also built a church in honor of the prophet St. Elias on Mount Carmel. Overall, the efforts against the Unia in Greece and Cyprus brought back nearly everyone, while those in the Arab Levant turned the tide and ensured that about 2/3 of the Arab Christians were Orthodox. This may not sound impressive, but one must remember that at one point, the flocks in the cities had largely gone over to the Unia, and at one point, the only Orthodox Christians were in the villages. The counter-Unia efforts not only kept those in the villages Orthodox, but made significant inroads into the cities, slowly converting large portions of the Uniates in Aleppo, while re-establishing the Orthodox Church as the largest sect in Homs, Damascus, and Beirut. The mission to the Old Believers. The reasons and justifications offered for the Old Believers' schism are beyond the scope of this video, as are the theories as to why they were using what appeared to have been old Antiochian traditions, such as the sign of the cross with only 2 fingers. But after their schism in the mid-17th century, the Church made a significant effort to repair the damage that had been done by figures such as the deposed Patriarch Nikon. Efforts to mend the schism started with such figures as Archbishop Afanasy Lyubimov of Kolmogorin of Arkhangelsk, who, upon taking his position in 1682, waged a moderately successful campaign to convert the voluminous Old Believers in that area. But more successful were the efforts started in 1871 when Metropolitan Platon of Moscow sanctioned an initiative by Archbishop Nikiforos of Astrakhan and Stavropol. Archbishop Nikiforos, whom we discussed earlier under the name Nikiforos Theotoki, had been in dialogue with several groups of Old Believers in what is now eastern Ukraine and had allowed parishes to use the pre-Niconian rites. Inspired by the success of the program created by Archbishop Nikifor, 2 monastics, Father Michael Kalmykov and the monk Nikodim, began reaching out to Old Believer communities in the region where the modern borders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus intersect. In 1798, bishops were allowed to ordain priests for the Old Believers so long as they used the pre-Niconian rites, and an official outline of union was created known as the 11 Articles of the Yedinoveri. The term Yedinoveri means co-religionists, and has since then been used to describe those Old Believers who came back into communion with the Church and were allowed to keep their pre-Niconian rites. St. Macarius Nevsky, whom we discussed in the previous video, also worked amongst the Old Believers in Altai in the late 19th century, despite his main missionary endeavor being the conversion of pagans and Muslims. In 1917, a major milestone was met when they received their own bishop, the hieromartyr Simeon Sliev, within the Holy Synod, due to the fact there were nearly 600 Yedinovary communities within the Russian Empire. In covering the period from 1600 to 1917, we have had to leave out a substantial portion of material that, though interesting and worthwhile on its own merit, we were compelled by the interest of keeping to a time limit to leave out. But we would like to encourage you to read this material by consulting the bibliography in the video description below. Furthermore, we want to thank our Patreon subscribers for their support and generosity. This enables us to create more content like this and at more frequent intervals.